Wrestling fans know him as Greg The Hammer Valentine. He was born Jonathan Wisniewski on September 20th, 1951, and was the son to a wrestler known as Johnny Valentine. Wisniewski was born in Seattle, Washington, and was raised around the business, in particular a time in his teenage years while he traveled the Texas territories with his father. And while in college over the summer, Valentine just decided, the school stuff ain't for me. I'm going to go ahead and get into the family business of becoming a professional wrestler. Wisniewski's pursuit of the business was met with some resistance by his father. Wisniewski found himself training with Stu Hart up in Calgary by the year 1970. Stu Hart trained him for a while and got his start, but eventually Wisniewski came back to the States and ended up in Detroit, where he finished his wrestling training under the Sheik. Not the Iron Sheik, but the Sheik. Wisniewski initially did not want to live off of his father's name, so at first he toyed around with a couple different names, like Babyface Nelson and Johnny Fargo, where he teamed with a guy that was named Don Fargo, and they were a tag team for a few years, pretty much between 1971 and 1974. They did a lot of stuff in a territory named the National Wrestling Federation, and also did some stuff in Texas as well. After their split, Wisniewski went to Florida, and there he was convinced to start wrestling under the name Johnny Valentine Jr., which very shortly after morphed into him becoming Greg The Hammer Valentine. Interesting side note on this is he was actually initially marketed as Johnny Valentine's brother and not his son. The thought being that Johnny Valentine having a son would make him sound too old. You gotta love the wrestling business. Valentine, as he was now known as, would spend a nice year or so in Florida. He would also do his first tours of Japan during this time, but by the summer of 1976, he ended up in Jim Crockett Jr.'s Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, a unique situation where he pretty much stepped into his father's spot. This was, of course, due to Johnny Valentine breaking his neck in that infamous plane crash. Yes, that plane crash that also contained Ric Flair, Bob Bruggers, etc. Speaking of Ric Flair, Valentine would end up teaming with him there in Mid-Atlantic. They won the NWA World Tag Team titles twice there, and also held the Mid-Atlantic Tag Team Championships. Their most memorable feuds being with the Andersons of all people. Ironically enough, Flair would be marketed as one of the Andersons' cousins almost a decade later, but that's besides the point. It was a very heated tag team feud. After that feud closed out in the spring of 1978, Flair was pushed into the world title ranks, while Valentine still toiled in the mid-card tag teams, spending time in a weird tag team with Baron Von Raschke. Although they did win the NWA World Tag Team Championship, Valentine was also tested as a singles guy, as he was in a pretty major feud with Chief Wahoo McDaniel over the Mid-Atlantic Championship. Just another notable feud that Valentine had during this time, and right before he split for the WWF in the fall of 1978. This, of course, was the Vince Sr. days, and Valentine was brought in to be managed by the Grand Wizard, and notably wrestled Bob Backlund to a 1-hour draw at MSG. After about a year, though, Valentine was ready to go ahead and return to Mid-Atlantic. When Valentine came back, he attempted to reform his tag team with Flair, but Flair at the time was a babyface, so he declined. So Valentine ended up forming a tag team with Ray Stevens instead, won the NWA World Tag Team Championships with him as well. After this played out for a bit, Valentine then feigned a babyface turn turn and rejoined Flair as a good guy. Of course, this was short-lived and ultimately led to a series of matches between the two. And even though this was a very high-profile feud, it's not talked about as much as some other things because honestly, they were feuding over the NWA United States Heavyweight Championship. In 1981, he decided, hey, I'm going to go back up north and work for the McMahon. There was basically a built-in storyline between him and Bob Backlund from having that 60-minute draw. So he feuded with Backlund for a while. Also had notable matches with Pedro Morales in the Intercontinental Championship bracket. Still though, after about another year of that, he decided, hey, it's time to go back to Mid-Atlantic. From there, Valentine reignited his feud with Wahoo McDaniel, and then that also led into his classic rivalry with Roddy Piper. Of course, who could forget the insane dog collar matches that they had during this time? By mid-1984, though, Valentine found himself back in the WWF as part of the surge of talent signed by Vince Jr. Valentine found himself in the right place, right time for the national expansion. Valentine was obviously thought of a workhorse, but generally a mid-carder, feuding over the Intercontinental Championship with several different folks, including Tito Santana, the Junkyard Dog. From there, instead of Valentine being promoted to the main event, by 1985, he was locked into a tag team yet again, this time with Brutus Beefcake as the infamous Dream Team, where Valentine once again won tag team gold, securing the WWF tag team titles on August 24th, 1985. Their run then concluded by being defeated by the British Bulldogs at WrestleMania 2 in April of 1986. And this was a big point of contention in Valentine's career, as many believe, and he would also state, Valentine did not feel like he was being taken seriously by basically feeling like he was stuck in an afterthought tag team who was in the middle of a silly feud over a dog. Eventually, Dino Bravo was also brought in as part of the act, and basically the two of them ended up turning their backs on Beefcake, and Brutus would end up turning into a good guy. So then Bravo replaced him with Valentine, and they formed the new Dream Team. Soon that would all fizzle out though. From there, Valentine was back to being a singles wrestler, but ultimately was always used as a mid-card workhorse gatekeeper. Although he had notable feuds at this time with Don Morocco and Ronnie Garvin, a very interesting, a storyline that you don't actually see very often in wrestling, where you have two submission guys kind of going after each other, and the whole story is about them putting their move on each other and trying to counteract it. It culminated in a submission match at the 1990 Royal Rumble. Valentine would toe the company line right up until the beginning of the 1990s and on. In fact, in 1990, it was time to go ahead and throw him back into a tag team. This time, he teamed with the Honky Tonk Man, and they formed the team of Rhythm and Blues. At the end of the day, though, they were just kind of there and kind of merely an afterthought tag team. Rhythm and Blues was actually set to split, but Honky Tonk Man departed the company before they could finish the angle. After this, Valentine went into the, how do I say, well, it was essentially the twilight of his WWF career, but essentially his gimmick was the old cagey veteran underdog. And of course, you know, if they had wanted to, they could have done something really cool and gave him one last run. And there was a couple cool moments, like him lasting 40 minutes in the Royal Rumble in 1991, and him going after Flair in the 1992 Rumble, for example. But ultimately, he was just kind of there. His last match during his WWF run being a win over Skinner at a house show on January 25th, 1992. Oh, also, side note, footnote, during the year of 1991, technically Valentine did have a short little stint in the UWF, but it was literally just for a TV taping cycle, as he decided to shortly return to the WWF. Valentine, though, was scooped up by World Championship Wrestling in February of 1992. He He came right in and started teaming with Terry Taylor, and they had a run with what was called the WCW United States Tag Team Championships. Valentine then entered into a little feud with Dustin and Dusty Rhodes, which ended up coinciding with Valentine forming yet another tag team in his career, this time with Dick Slater. Of course, his WCW run started with high hope, but by the end of 1992, it was clear to Valentine that he was going to be just basically a job and setup guy for WCW, and he was having nothing of it, so he left. From there, Valentine resurfaced in the WWF with a couple key appearances that are the result of trivia questions, but nonetheless appearances, including an appearance as the Blue Knight at Survivor Series 1993, and another little memorable stint in the Royal Rumble in 1994. Valentine would stay active on the indies for the next few years, basically from around 1994 to 1996. Valentine would then resurface in World Championship Wrestling in 1996, where he was rarely used, rarely got the call to come to television, but I'm sure was one of those guys that kept collecting those sweet WCW checks for working about 4 or 5 dates a year. His last documented WCW match was on February 17th, 1998, with a win over Pat Tanaka. From there, you can say that Valentine pretty much hung it up, with the sporadic notable appearance, of course, including 1999's infamous Heroes of Wrestling pay-per-view. He was also involved in the short-lived X-Wrestling Federation as an investor and as an in-ring performer. Valentine was then inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2004. Valentine then made a one-off appearance in 2005 at WWE Homecoming, wrestling Rob Conway is just sort of a special kind of deal there. In 2007, he competed for Canadian Grand Prix Wrestling. In 2007, reformed the Dream Team with Brutus Beefcake for a Juggalo Championship Wrestling event. You'll still see him pop up and make an appearance from time to time on WWE television, and in my opinion, Greg the Hammer Valentine is one of the more underrated wrestlers of all time, especially in more modern recent times. He was a guy that could have easily been counted on to do so much more. Be that as it may, I think everyone could agree that he could be counted on as a solid hand by every company that he ever worked for. At this time, I turn it over to you, the audience. I want to know down in the comment your favorite Greg Valentine memories, matches, or moments. Be sure to leave a like on your way out the door. Also, please subscribe to the channel if you have not done so already. Until next time, we see you right here on Pro Wrestling Planet.